The reason I wanted to do this particular event is sooner or later, in my experience, every creative professional wants to create work under a name that's not their own. In this particular workshop, you're going to get a good primer on how to do that and the somewhat dangerous pitfalls you can run into along the way. Before we dive in, I want to just mention, I'm not an attorney, a tax advisor, or financial advisor. So do not rely on this presentation for advice, specifically advice for things that you should personally do or what you should do with your particular company. I wanted to run this workshop to create a very general, very broad awareness of options and challenges that creatives face when they're creating, releasing, and monetizing their work. And when they want to be able to do that without it being easily traceable back to their personal name. Before creating or using a fictional identity, it's really important to consult with an attorney for legal advice specific to your situation and to make sure your intellectual property rights remain fully protected. Now, I linked to a variety of resources in the slide set that goes with this workshop, but those links are not an endorsement for anything or anyone. They are just possible examples of what I'm talking about. So it seems like every creative sooner or later wants to create and release work that's not directly tied to their name. And if you spend a decade building up your name in a particular industry or career or genre, you do become well known for a specific set of skills. People come to believe that they know what your name stands for. So when you start creating work outside that well-defined box, you send a message to those employers or those loyal customers or those fans that you can no longer be relied upon. The message that these folks want to hear becomes diluted. For example, a lawyer that starts writing mystery books will have clients wondering if they're getting the best possible representation. A filmmaker that makes horror movies is going to confuse people when he starts doing kid shows. Sometimes people create a professional alter ego to handle those particular situations. And sometimes creatives create aliases for even more personal reasons. For example, they want to be able to protect their personal security while they're creating and selling their work. They're not just looking for good branding, they're looking for something more. Commonly, people create alternate identities in order to achieve some or all of the goals listed to the right: personal security, ease of marketing, diversification of revenue, personal or corporate control, creative collaboration, or because they want to be a whistleblower. Now, I meant the last one is in some cases the most interesting and the most difficult. And it's shocking how many people who want to be whistleblowers also want to do it under an alternate ego. Sometimes the fictional people are created by an individual creative, like an individual writer, an individual filmmaker, an individual actor. And sometimes fictional identities are created by a company as a method for securing and selling work they've paid for. Sometimes people will even create a worldwide alias to give credit for projects that no one really wants their name on at all. If you were to go on to IMDb right now and you were to look up Alan Smithy, you would find out he has worked on a hell of a lot of projects, and a lot of those projects have been really bad. And so if I'm a director, for example, and the producers maybe do a whole bunch of things that I didn't want to do, and I don't think that the work accurately reflects me, I can ask to be credited as Alan Smithy. He's been created specifically to take credit for all the worst work in the world. Now let's talk about some other fictional people and the reasons that they were created. One of the most successful self-published authors ever was Mark Twain, and his real name was, of course, Samuel Clemens. It's said that he spent a lot of time on riverboats, and he really liked it when the crew called out Mark Twain as they plumbed the depths of the Mississippi so they didn't run their boats aground. And his audiences were far more likely to buy books from an author with a poetic name like Mark Twain than some guy named Samuel Clemens. And it's interesting to note that some of his most famous work is actually rooted in the river, specifically Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Another famous example of a pseudonym is Miss Manners. She was a very famous author of many best-selling books on etiquette, but in reality, she was Judith Martin. She was a very famous Washington, D.C. writer and editor, and she chose the name Miss Manners to protect her personal reputation as a serious writer. And she went so far even as to wear costumes when she went to interviews. Dear Anne Rice and Anne Declos also had pen names to protect their existing careers and private lives from their work. And when Dear Abby, for example, she and her sister, Ann Landers, started writing advice in newspapers to people with a variety of problems. Their names were broadcast across the entire country, and they wanted to maintain some semblance of a private life. And so they wrote under Dear Abby and Ann Landers as a way to protect themselves. Anne Rice, very famous author, she wrote erotica under a pen name for many years. Another example of creating a fictional person for fun and profit is Carolyn Keene and Frank Dixon. This is actually one of the stories of fictional people I find the most interesting. There was a guy, and his name, it was a publisher named Edward Stratemeyer, and he would write outlines out for Nancy Drew books and Hardy Boys books, and then he would send them out to a variety of different authors, and they would send back the books, and he would edit them, and he would then publish them and release them, hiring a bunch of different writers to work for him and forcing them all of their work to be published under pseudonyms. He ensured that he had complete control over his business. In effect, he was Carolyn Keene and Frank Dixon, even though other writers were doing the writing, and he was just creating the outlines. Another author that's very famous, that has the same kind of history, is Betty Crocker. I don't know if you know anything about Betty Crocker cookbooks, but they have a whole test lab, and they have a whole bunch of cooks that work together, and they create recipes, but the recipes are published in books that have Betty Crocker on the cover. So in effect, Betty Crocker gets the credit, not the individual writers and researchers. Harlequins required authors to create a pen name whenever they wrote, and they could only use that pen name when they were working for Harlequin. Anne Mathers was a very popular nom de plume for a prolific author named Mildred Griefson. And Harlequin did this routinely. I don't know if they still do it. Their ability to own the pen names and the ability, if they wanted to release books under those pen names, regardless of who was writing them, made Harlequin a true giant in the industry, and they did not have to worry about authors leaving them and taking big sections of their market with them. Cool. So those are examples of fictional people that have been created, and a variety of different reasons that people and companies created them. Since most of the people that are in this workshop are people who are creative or people who own companies who produce content, these are good examples to think about when you're considering creating fictional identities. Now, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about copyright. I strongly suggest that you speak to an attorney if you're thinking about producing content under pen name or nom de plume. As we discussed at length in a workshop we have on copyright law with attorney Paul Levine, when somebody creates an original work like a book or a film or an illustration or musical composition or whatever, copyright adheres automatically. And subsequently, registering the work at the Copyright Office gives a lot of benefits to creatives, including statutory damages, which make those rights easier for the owners to defend. Now, you may or may not choose to register your work at the Copyright Office. I strongly suspect that most financially successful professional creatives do, in fact, register their work at the Copyright Office routinely. When if I work at the Copyright Office, it is not a good idea, without a lot of forethought and planning, to register it in the name of somebody that you are not. Like, you need to really talk to an attorney before you register your work at the Copyright Office using a nom de plume or a company name. And in fact, you should talk to your attorney about how you should register your work at the Copyright Office in order to provide the maximum quantity and quality of protection to you in the short and in the long term. Also, when you publish or release your work, usually somewhere on it, you put a copyright notice or a copyright statement that identifies the owner of the work. Even if you don't register the work at copyright.gov, you can still put the copyright notice on. Most people do put the notice on things they care about because it identifies what individual or company owns the content. That event will be publicly visible and find anything has been registered there by that company or person. The address information provided during registration will be visible. For many authors, that will be their home address. So if you want to use a pen name, company name, or a different address in your copyright statements, you're going to speak to an attorney about that. You want to make sure that you understand exactly how to register your work at the Copyright Office, because here's the thing. Copyright law protects your right to publish, distribute, license, sell, and create derivative works. So if you don't get those details right, you can run into trouble publishing, distributing, licensing, selling your creative works. So make sure you get the details absolutely right. Your copyright's going to last for, in most cases, over 100 years. It can be inherited by your spouse, your children, their children. Make sure that you don't do something squirrely with your copyright registration without talking to an attorney first. One of the reasons I think people choose not to talk to an attorney is because they think it's expensive. You have no idea how expensive it is not to talk to an attorney when you do something like screw up your copyright registrations for a bunch of work. There are entertainment attorneys all over Los Angeles that will happily talk to you about how to register your work at the Copyright Office and will advise you based upon the requirements that you have in terms of concealing your identity, concealing your address, etc. Just make sure you get that right. Now, assuming that you're an author using a pseudonym and assuming you've worked out how you want to handle copyright registration and copyright notices within your book with a lawyer, you may just be able to put your pen name on the cover page and title page of your book. So, for example, if you look at the mystery novel, it says Pirate Island Mystery, Fulton Ames. Right? Inside the book, your legal name or your pen name or your company name, whatever you've worked out with your lawyer, will be listed on your copyright statement. And the work will have been registered however it was supposed to be registered at copyright.gov. But by putting a pen name on the book, you can then promote and sell the book using the pseudonym. And that has some advantages. For example, as a reader, I might read one Fulton Ames book and I might think, wow, I really like that mystery novel. And I want other ones just like it. But I don't know what the book names are. So how am I going to look it up? Chances are I'm going to look it up by the name of the author. So I might look up Fulton Ames. The author might create another pseudonym that they would write science fiction under, and maybe another one that they write romances under. And the reason is because then the pen name becomes a way to find the kind of books or the genre of books written by that particular author. And it prevents people who like a particular style of their writing for a particular genre from running into kinds of books that they might not like at all. For example, a parent that has kids that enjoys Fulton Ames kids books might not enjoy books written by N.A. Fulton, which are adult mysteries, and they might not want their kids stumbling across those. So the pen names actually serve as just an identifier for kind of book written by a particular author. Right. Note that some resellers like Amazon may let you list the work this way under this particular pseudonym's name. But then years later, months or years later, they might come back to you and require that you prove that you own the book. And that will usually involve providing a copy of your copyright registration and a letter or letters indicating that you or your company have the right to release or publish or sell the work, and perhaps some kind of statement stating your pen name, etc. So one of the reasons you have to get the copyright details right is subsequently, sometime in the future, you may have to actually prove you own the book that has somebody else's name on it. So whatever solution you make, you have to make for the long term, and you have to be able to have documentation of it going forward. You need to make sure that your rights are secured, not just today, but tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and for another few decades. Now let's talk briefly about fictitious business name statements. The reason that I wanted to talk about fictitious business name statements is specifically because when you go on a lot of author sites on Facebook or LinkedIn and so forth, and new creators talk about not wanting to publish or produce under their own name, people always say, hey, just file a fictitious business name statement, etc. That can, in theory, when you create a fictitious business name statement or a DBA, you can conduct business under your alias. You can advertise, sell, accept payment, kind contracts, etc., using this new name. But there are devils in those details. For example, in most places, just business names expire. They don't live forever, so they have to be renewed on a regular basis. Some authors and other creatives seeking a more complete division between their true identity and the name they list on books and films and so forth, they file a fictitious business name statement, usually after consulting with their attorney, with the proper county and state authorities. And then they use that name to do business instead of their own to a significant degree. You're planning to be really famous. Creating and maintaining a fictitious business name can be really important to your personal security and your privacy, because it allows you to register yourself at a hotel without getting harassed, or you can make reservations on a cruise without every single person that's on the cruise knowing, oh my God, we've got a famous person on board. So if you're planning to be really famous, it can be really handy to have your own fictitious business name that you operate under. And we're all familiar with celebrities who've actually done this for years. They consciously maintain two different identities. Businesses also sometimes use fictitious business names to let their businesses operate under different names. For example, Flinchworthy Films might decide to also operate under Flinchworthy Publishing using a fictitious business name statement. Flinchworthy Films might produce books literally just to market their films. And they have no interest in earning any money from publishing. It might be the case that all the books that they make available on Amazon, they make available for free. But the reason that they actually create the books is specifically because they want to generate buzz and build an audience. Each book might ask readers who want to see or. So in that sense, Flinchworthy Films and Flinchworthy Publishing aren't really two different businesses. They're just one business operation under two names for marketing purposes. It's important to note that people can still find out the legal name of a given creator or company. In fact, one reason people are required to file the fictitious business name statement in order to conduct business is specifically so interested parties can find out their identity if required. The vast majority of people will never be inclined to do, which means it may be a really good option for you to ask your lawyer about. If you have a huge number of people that write political content, erotica, romances, etc., that want to create that kind of separation, just remember, it's probably not something you do it today and then you forget about it tomorrow. And you want to make sure you're doing everything by the book. The next thing I just want to talk briefly about is creating an LLC or a corporation. I think you probably know, when you create an LLC or corporation, you give it a name. So in effect, it becomes a virtual person that does business for you. Now, many filmmakers set up a company whenever they produce films, and many authors and screenwriters set up a business through which they sell their work and pay their business expenses. They sometimes list their company name rather than their own names on work that they create. For example, an indie filmmaker may decide to promote a film using his company name instead of his own name, even though he's a writer, producer, and he owns all the production, all the intellectual property, the copyright on the script, and he also owns the production company. So even though he owns everything, it's really all him. He might decide to publish and release some content under that company name instead of his own name. Sometimes when multiple creatives are working together on a project and sharing the related revenues and expenses, they'll set up an LLC or a corporation through which all the joint work is sold or licensed, and that entity may have a specific name. For example, Jenny Smith and Randy White together might be Clyde Wilberford, and that would get listed as a credit on projects they decide to work on together. And that's a good way for them to separate their work as individuals from the work that they do together. One company can own one or more companies, and the companies may be even different states or different countries. So, for example, my company set up in Delaware, Flinchworthy Films, might own Scary Productions here in California, and it might own Terrifying Productions in Wisconsin, and it might own Wicked Productions in Wyoming. Because you can have one company own multiple companies, in effect, you can create several layers of names that distance you as a business owner from the work that you create with different people and from the projects that you do in different places. The important thing to understand is that if you're going to be operating here in the state of California, if you speak to your attorney, they may suggest that even if you set up a company in Delaware, when you're operating in the state of California, you have to register here as a foreign corporation. And when you do that, you'll have to provide an address for the business that's local to this state. So when talk about setting up your company and talk about separating your pieces of intellectual property, I think you'll find that the details will really matter depending upon the kind of work that you're doing and how many companies you want to be able to support and how many places you want to pay taxes. Sometimes I hear people talk about setting up a company in Nevada or setting up a company in another state as a way to save money on taxes and also to protect their identity. And it's just important to make sure you talk with an attorney about that, because that may not be a good idea and it may not be something that you can actually do from a practical standpoint, particularly over a long period of time. So that's something you should look into when you get a chance. Cool. There are businesses that you can work with to provide a legal business address for your view signs so you can avoid using your home address on forms, but you need to make sure they don't cause you hassles going forward. For example, setting up a virtual office in a given city might make you have to pay business taxes in that city, or might make you have to get a business license there. Mostly when you are starting a business, you are making a long-term decision. So consulting with legal and tax advisors is smart. So because I've been running events for a really long time, one of the things I have noticed is that from time to time, I will get somebody come through, and surprisingly, a lot of them are military folks, and some of them are from other industries that have to do with medicine or have to do with other political stuff. And they'll want to do something of an expose, or they want to do something that's whistleblower oriented. And when they reach out to me, their issue is they want to be able to hide their identity and their home address while releasing this information they feel is very important to the world. They want to write a book or release a documentary or produce a podcast or sell their story, but they want to remain behind the scenes and isolated from the repercussions of that disclosure. Your best bet is probably not to dive in and release the work yourself, because all the techniques listed here might not really provide the security you are looking for. A good entertainment attorney can give you some advice on how to get your work to people who can successfully and safely release the information to the world without necessarily putting you, your career, your future at risk. Furthermore, they can design contracts that not only protect your identity, but if you have media that you want to sell, for example, you have video clips or you have documents that you want to provide, they can make it that content is protected, remains something that you have control over, and yet is something that can be distributed without actually causing you adverse effects. So if you're one of the people that routinely thinks, wow, I really would like to release this information, I think it's really important to the world, and I don't know how to do it, I think you really want to talk to an entertainment attorney and specifically let them know what information you're trying to release. And you may need to talk to 2 or 3 or 4 in order to get the advice that's most appropriate to your particular situation. I think it's definitely something that you probably do not want to do without taking that step, because you can make a mistake that can be pretty injurious to you and your career and your livelihood going forward. So I just put that out there for the few people that actually are coming here because they want to do whistleblower content, because every year I meet 7 or 8 of them. Let's talk about a few very specific advantages of setting up alternate identities for you and your business or you and your work. Owning one or more pseudonyms or identities allows you to establish multiple clearly defined brands, and it lets you create work in new genres without confusing or annoying your existing audience with genre that you've made happy in other genres. So it could be the case, and I do know, in fact, several authors who have 4 or 5 different pen names that they use on a regular basis. They write science fiction, they write kids' books, they write romance novels, and they write Westerns. And they write under 4 genres, and by using the pen names, they make sure that every target market gets exactly the content that they want. And when people look up the pen name on Amazon or look it up on books or in Barnes & Noble, they get exactly the content they want. If you're creating a joint work with a collaborator, using a pseudonym that all of your joint work is published under makes it much easier for each of you to continue to pursue your individual work while giving you a way to effectively promote and protect the work that you do together. If you create identities that you own and release work that is created by others under a pseudonym, you can easily add or replace creators. For example, if you are doing something like Nancy Drew Mysteries, and you call the author of the Nancy Drew Mysteries Carolyn Keene, and then you have 15 or 20 different authors creating the books that are published under that particular pen name, it means that you never really have to worry where your next book is going to come from, and that anybody who searches for Carolyn Keene is always going to find the Nancy Drew books, and they're going to find all of the Nancy Drew books regardless of who they were written by. It's true that the names of the real authors may never be known, but it's also true that the pseudonym becomes a true brand, and that brand can be very powerful. As you age, another reason that having a pen name is handy is it's something that you can pass down to multiple family members. For example, if you look at Dear Abby, you'll notice that the people now writing as Dear Abby are actually, I believe, her children. The use of a pen name supersedes the individual that was actually originally created, the creation and use of a pen name actually supersedes the life of the person that created the pen name and allows it to live on in a way that an individual human cannot. So that's a real advantage to creating a pen name. It has a longevity that you personally don't. The disadvantages are that you need to make sure that you understand the copyright, business, tax, and other details involved in setting up an alias, because if you do it wrong, it can cause you a lot of hassle and a lot of expense going forward, and or it won't provide the protection that you're looking for. There are also real benefits to marketing your work in TV interviews, podcasts, and public appearances as yourself. And if you're known as a real identity, people value that, the fact that they can see their creators at Comic-Con, or they can see their creators doing book signings, or they can see their creators at film festivals and so forth. When you are running or creating under this second personality or this alter ego, when you turn up to places, you are yourself, and you either have to let people know that I write as John Smith, but I'm really Jane Smith. So in which case you're outing yourself and your alter ego is no longer secret. Or you have to go in costume like Miss Manners did. And that can be a hassle. Another thing, which is getting to be more and more of a problem, is that some social media sites require you to operate under your true identity, and they will require you to prove your identity in order to advertise, promote, publish, release, etc. So since your alter ego doesn't have its own phone, its own driver's license, it doesn't have those documents because it's a pen name, that can be a problem when it comes to advertising and promoting. In some cases, you can get around that because if you're a company, you can just say, I'm the publisher and I've got several authors working for me, and you can just use your pen names as basically the pen names on the products are ignored because you're a company, and just like any publisher, you publish multiple books by multiple authors. But in some cases, it can be you can run into trouble when you're trying to set up a TikTok channel, for example, for one of your pen names, and you start getting asked for proof that you are who you say you are. Or on the perfect example is YouTube. At some point, when you run ads, will ask you to prove your identity. And if you're setting up a channel for a particular pen name or a particular alter ego, they start going, that's not you though. So this is supposed to be this author's channel, but you're not this author. So who's this author? And you need to be aware that you can run into trouble trying to have two personalities. Finally, some people may see you as shady or less than reputable if they find out you're working under another name. And they may ask, if you're not doing anything wrong, why not use your real name? It's important that people don't perceive you as trying to perpetrate some kind of fraud. And it's something to be aware of. When you create a pen name or an alternate ego that you're going to do business under, you have to be very conscious of the reasons that you're doing it, the justifications you have, and you have to make sure that you do it by the book, because you're going to be living with that virtual person for a long time. I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about is, what do you do if you're exposed? And the truth is, unless you're engaged in doing something really wild or working with a really aggressive audience, if you're doing politics, for example, or you're doing this, there are some audiences that you may create content for that are going to be really aggressive, and they're going to be really vicious at cracking down on people that are saying things that they don't want to hear. And they may very well decide to dive deep on who you are and where you can be found, etc. But 99.99% of the time, that's just really not going to be the case. So you don't really have to worry about exposure unless your audience is the kind of people that are problematic from that perspective. It may be the case that an occasional person will figure out who you are and for some reason may decide to tell other people. And at that point, you have to decide whether or not it's best to ignore this allegation that you are this alter ego, or just to go ahead and embrace it. And the truth is that most creatives do eventually just go ahead and acknowledge their alternate identities, and their work becomes popular enough and their fan bases loves them enough to simply accept them for who they are. And for example, when Anne Rice was first started out her publishing career, she certainly didn't want people to know that she was writing erotica. And yet, as time went by, people said, hey, this erotica author is actually Anne Rice. And she didn't deny it. She just ignored them. And it turned out nobody cared. So when your fan base loves you, you can get away with pretty much doing anything. And if your fan base doesn't really love you, you're going to have difficulty because they're going to get mad no matter how you manage to step out of line. So if you are working with a really radical fan base that will never accept a dual identity, it may be time to consider not creating work for that particular fan base. Cool. Great. I have a whole bunch of other content that is available that talks about how to write, produce, and sell content profitably. And when you get a chance, you can go ahead and look through this. There's other content. So someone says, how can you get paid remotely without revealing your identity and address? Just having a DBA, how do you hide your address then? So that's something, again, you could talk to an attorney about, but the truth is that more and more, that kind of thing is being made more and more impossible because it gets used for illegal purposes on a regular basis. So at least in my personal experience, it's been a long time since I've been able to accept money in a way that doesn't require me to prove that I have a business and doesn't require me to provide financial information so that I can be taxed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know how to do what you're asking. All right, great. So I had an amazing time hanging out with you this evening. Do reach out to me via email at Nancy Fulton Meetups if you have questions. I very much look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to being of service to you going forward. And I'm going to be doing another workshop next week. So I hope you decide to join it. Some of my workshops are available free, and you can find out about them through meetup.com, and some of them you sign up for by becoming a VIP Pro. Cool. Thanks, guys.